Hi guys, welcome back to my podcast. So today is the fifth episode of my wildlife podcast, and I thought I should switch things up a bit. So I'm actually going to be talking about a topic that I really love, which is bird watching from your own window. And I find this to be truly fascinating because a lot of times people who live in cities feel like there aren't that many diverse bird species that you can see while literally sitting in your own window or balcony. But I'm here to tell you guys that if you're patient and if you're lucky, and if you sit at your window or in your balcony during the early evening hours or during the early morning hours as well, if you're lucky, you can get to see a lot of different bird species. And I love bird watching from my own window. And I live in Mumbai, and I've seen over 16 different bird species from my window, including some common birds like the Asian Koel and the coppersmith barbet, as well as some birds that I just did not expect to see from my window, like the greater cuckoo and the white-throated kingfisher, and some other birds as well. So if you guys wanna hear me talk about the most common birds that you can see from your window in Mumbai, then keep on watching this podcast. And I'm going to be starting off with one of the most common birds in Mumbai, which is the Asian Koel. Now, Asian Koels are really common. They're really well adapted to living in cities as well as other urban areas. And what's truly fascinating about Asian Koels is that they're obligate brood parasites. And what I mean by that is that Asian Koels actually don't build their own nest. The female Asian koels will find a host nest like a common crow or a jungle crow's nest which already has eggs, and they will actually replace one of their own eggs with the crow's eggs, and they do this so that they don't have to raise their own young. And what's truly fascinating is that the Asian koel eggs are actually evolutionarily designed to hatch 3 days before the crow's eggs, so that they can get a head start in size and strength, so that they're not outcompeted by the crow chicks as soon as they're born. And what I find even more fascinating is that these Asian koel chicks, just a few days after they're born, they learn to mimic the begging call of the crow chicks so that they can blend in really seamlessly with the other chicks, and the crow doesn't realize that this is not one of their own chicks. And I find that to be truly fascinating. And I also read an article about when the female Asian koel is actually trying to swap the eggs. It's a really interesting thing that I read in the article about how the male Asian koel will actually try to distract the crow from the nest so that the crow moves away from the nest while the female Asian koel can actually swap the eggs. And I find this to be a truly fascinating behavior. And Asian koels are mainly frugivorous birds. They mainly eat fruits like figs and papaya and other different fruits out in the wild. And what I find really interesting is that Asian koels are really amazing seed dispersers as well. When they eat these fruits, the seeds pass through their guts, and then through their poop, seed dispersal actually happens. And what I find even more fascinating is that Asian koels, since they have such large beaks and they eat such huge fruits that have a lot of hard seeds inside them, they will actually regurgitate these seeds. And a lot of times different trees like sandalwood can actually be planted near one another due to this particular reason. Since the Asian koels regurgitate so many of these hard seeds, they're actually dispersing the seeds even through that method, and a lot of times trees like sandalwood get planted near each other in the tens because of this reason. And I find this to be truly fascinating. And Asian koels, as I mentioned, they're extremely loud birds, and they also have a lot of sexual dimorphism, which means that they have a lot of different physical traits between the male and female Asian koels. And the male Asian koels are completely black in color, whereas the female Asian koels have a speckled color where it's a lighter shade of black with grey, and it's a very beautiful speckled color. And I find Asian koels to be one of the most beautiful birds ever, and they're truly really common. And while bird watching from my window, a lot of times, even if I don't see them, I will be able to hear their call because they're really loud birds. And their mating calls are especially super loud. And a lot of times they'll be perched in the trees, they'll be eating fruits in the fruiting trees that I can see from my window across the street. And I really find Asian koels to be one of the most fascinating birds ever. And the next bird that I'm going to be talking about, that are again one of the most common birds in Mumbai that you can see from your window, are mynas. Now, the two species of myna that I'm going to be talking about, the common Indian myna and the jungle myna. The jungle mynas are found mostly in jungles. That's not what I'm going to be talking about in this podcast. I'm going to be talking about the common Indian myna first. So the common mynas are one of the most beautiful birds ever. And what's truly fascinating about these birds is that they're terrestrial foragers. And as I mentioned in my previous podcast, what that means is that these mynas will actually hop on the forest floor, and they will move the leaves and twigs with their beaks, and the insects that start crawling because of that, they will actually feed on those insects. And this is truly fascinating, as this is the exact reason why they have a really beautiful symbiotic relationship with agriculture as well. Whereas when farmers are actually plowing the fields, what they do is they will actually sometimes be seen hopping behind the farmer, since after the land is being plowed, what happens is a lot of insects get disturbed, and they actually hop right behind and feast on these insects since they're terrestrial foragers. And I find that to be truly, truly fascinating. And mynas actually, um, what's even more fascinating about mynas is that they actually don't build their own nest too, but what they do is they actually steal the nests of other birds like sparrows. They will actually really aggressively drive away these sparrows or these other smaller birds from their nests. I read an article about how they have actually been even seen to kill other chicks of other nests in order to inhabit the nest as their own. And I find that to be really, really fascinating because I did not expect that of mynas. But what I really, really find even more fascinating about another species of myna that I read about, there's another species of myna called the common hills myna that is actually one of the greatest avian mimickers of human speech. And I find that to be truly fascinating. And another thing that I read about mynas is that they are actually monogamous, and they mate for life. And a lot of times, even while allopreening, which is basically when they clean each other's feathers and all, they will actually still be in pairs, and they will even feed in pairs. And even in the day when they're sitting in the shade, in the canopy of the trees, they will sometimes be in pairs. And I find that to be truly fascinating. And mynas are definitely one of the most common birds that you can see from your window in Mumbai, and they're one of the most beautiful birds ever. And again, they have a really beautiful call, and it's one of the most beautiful bird sounds ever. And I really, really love mynas. I think they're one of the most fascinating birds ever. Mynas actually are even known for communally roosting together, which means that they will actually, during the early evening hours, all the mynas in the particular area will actually collect together on a tree or on some wires, and you can actually hear them making a lot of sounds during that time. And I find mynas to be truly fascinating. And what I find really, really fascinating is I also read an article about how mynas were actually introduced to certain parts of Australia, since they have such a symbiotic relationship with agriculture where they eat the pests. They were considered like a natural pest control. Since they naturally eat so many pests, they've actually brought to certain parts of Australia. And what actually happened is now, since so many years have passed, they've actually turned into an invasive species. And what I mean by that is that since they were not native to certain parts of Australia, they have not been native to Australia at all, and they're not endemic there. What often happens is the hollows where they reside, and a lot of times their nesting sites are also the nesting sites of other animals like opossums in Australia, and also other birds like the kookaburra. And a lot of times, since these birds have not adapted over thousands of years to live in the same habitat as mynas, since mynas are not native there, they actually cannot, the mynas outcompete these native birds, and that can be really bad for the endemic species of certain parts of Australia. So, and that is one of the reasons why the myna is actually considered an invasive species in certain parts of Australia. And now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about, that are again one of the most common birds that you can see from your window, are coppersmith barbets. And these birds are one of the most fascinating birds ever. I literally love coppersmith barbets. They're frugivorous birds, and a lot of times I'll be sitting by my window and I'll be able to hear the tuk 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 of their call. And I find that to be truly fascinating because most birds actually, when they make noise, you can see their beak open, but coppersmith barbets actually don't open their beak most of the times when they make that noise. And the reason they're called coppersmith barbets is because that tuk 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 actually sounds like a coppersmith cutting copper. And I find coppersmith barbets to be one of the most fascinating birds, and they actually build their nest by excavating tiny hollows in the tree. And these hollows, they are so meticulous about it that they make sure that it's really clean. And sometimes coppersmith barbets will actually make a couple of holes in the same tree where one will be for sleeping and one will be for nesting. And I find them to be one of the most fascinating birds. And they actually, when they're feeding on the fruits that they like probably if they're on a banyan tree or if they're on a fig tree and they're eating the fruits, they can actually eat fruits 3 times their own body weight in a day. And I find that to be truly fascinating. And since their digestion process is so quick and efficient that they can actually eat 3 times their body weight and poop it out really quickly, what happens is that seed dispersal happens really efficiently because of these birds. And I find coppersmith barbets to be one of the most fascinating birds ever. And definitely they're one of the most beautiful birds ever, and one of the most visually striking birds ever, with the most colorful plumage and the most beautiful colors ever. And I literally love coppersmith barbets. I think they're one of the most beautiful birds ever. And again, they're really, really common from your window if you're patient. And since they're really small birds, if you just look through the foliage in the canopy of the trees, if you're lucky, you might get to see a coppersmith barbet. And now the fourth bird that I'm going to be talking about are the red-vented bulbuls. Now these are really really beautiful bulbuls that are again really common in Mumbai, and if you're lucky, you can really spot a lot of them during the early evening hours. I've seen so many of them again eating fruits in the fruiting trees that are across the street. They're mainly frugivorous birds, so they eat a lot of fruits. And red-vented bulbuls I've also seen with the fifth bird species that I'm going to be talking about, which are red whiskered bulbuls. And a lot of times I will see a red whiskered bulbul perched on a tree, and then a few minutes later I've seen another red whiskered bulbul, and then I've seen a few minutes later a red-vented bulbul. They're really common birds, and they're mainly frugivorous. And red-vented bulbuls actually make these really beautiful open cup nests where they're like a bowl like this, and they make it out of twigs and they make it out of other material. And they again eat a lot of fruits, and they have a really efficient digestive system. So um, there's a lot of seed dispersal that happens after they eat the fruits, and then they poop out the seeds, and a lot of seed dispersal happens through this method. And I again find red whiskered bulbuls and red vented bulbuls to be one of the most beautiful birds ever, and they're really really common from your windows that you can see in Mumbai. And now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about, that is again a really really common bird in Mumbai that you can see from your window, are drongos. And I find drongos to be one of the most fascinating birds since they're highly highly territorial, and I've actually seen them mob. Mobbing is basically what birds do to defend their territory. They will actually fly towards other birds. Even if there are other larger birds, they will actually fly towards larger birds to defend their territory if there's a nest nearby, or even just to defend a fruiting tree. So drongos are actually really commonly known to mob other birds to defend their territory. And especially if there are fruiting trees that have a lot of insects nearby. I have read a lot of articles about how drongos will actually be perched on this tree and will actually not even allow certain squirrels or other birds to come near this tree, and they will actually mob them away from there, since they want to feed on all the insects that are on the fruiting trees. And I find drongos to be truly truly fascinating, and they're really common in Mumbai. And a lot of times I'll be sitting on my window and I'll see one perched on a wire or perched on a tree nearby, and they have a really unique hunting method where they actually fly and hunt the insects aerially. So I find that to be truly fascinating, and they eat insects like dragonflies and bees and other insects as well. And what I really find fascinating is I was actually reading an article about the greater racket-tailed drongo, and they have a really unique ability to actually mimic the alarm calls of other birds and mimic other bird calls as well. What they will actually do, I read about this in an article, is that they will actually, if they see like a babbler that has a food that they like, they will actually make the alarm call that would scare the babbler off of probably a predator of the babbler. So the babbler will actually get startled and leave the food, and the drongo will then feed on it. And I read in the article that the greater racket-tailed drongo can actually mimic 35 different voices, some of other drongo alarm calls, some of other bird calls, and some of the predators of the particular birds. And I find that to be truly truly fascinating, that they can actually mimic these different voices in order to get their own food. And I really really love drongos. I find them to be truly one of the most fascinating birds in the world. Now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about is another really common bird that I've seen from my window, and this is the seventh bird that I'm going to be talking about, I think, which is the shikra. And this is a really different bird than the other birds I spoke about, because this is a bird of prey. And what's really really unique about shikras is that they aren't that large birds of prey like the black kite or other birds, but they actually eat lizards, they eat mice, they eat other rodents and other smaller mammals. And they're really really fascinating because unlike other birds that hunt aerially like the black kite, the black kite also hunts as an ambush predator. The shikra is an ambush predator. So what it does is it will actually be sitting perched on a tree nearby, anywhere near its prey, and it will actually observe its prey for a while until the prey gets close enough, and then it actually dives in and catches the prey and then feeds on it. And I've actually seen shikras a couple of times eating lizards, and I've seen them eating mice as well. And shikras are one of the most fascinating birds ever, and they're really really common in cities as well, since they're really well adapted to living in gardens and areas near urban infrastructure as well. And now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about, that is again a really really beautiful and a really common bird that you can see from your window if you're lucky, is the purple sunbird. And purple sunbirds are one of the most beautiful birds ever. During the breeding season, the male purple sunbirds have a really vibrant glossy purplish sheen, whereas in the non-breeding season they become a little less duller and more brownish purple. And what's truly fascinating about purple sunbirds is that when they make their purse shaped hanging nest that actually sway in the wind, but they're strong enough that they actually don't fly away. Even when they're swaying in the wind, what's truly fascinating is that they actually make these nests with really lightweight materials like twigs and tiny sticks and tiny hay fibers, plant fibers, and different stuff in the natural habitat that they collect. But what they actually do is that after collecting all these lightweight materials, they will actually combine them with spider webs that they harvest. And I find that to be truly fascinating that they actually combine it all together with spider webs, and that is how it stays intact. And I find that to be truly fascinating. And I actually read in an article that 97% of the purple sunbird's diet is nectar from flowers like hibiscus and bottlebrush, but they're not completely vegetarian. And what I mean by that is during the breeding season, they actually really need protein. And so when they're collecting these spider webs, they will actually actively hunt on spiders, mainly during the breeding season since they need protein, and they will actually eat spiders as well as other tiny insects during their breeding season. So I find that to be really fascinating. Now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about is a really beautiful bird that I saw from my window, which is the white-throated kingfisher. And white-throated kingfishers are one of the most beautiful birds ever. As I mentioned, I've seen them so many times during trails, but a couple of times that I've seen them from my window, I was truly fascinated by seeing them. And what's really fascinating about white-throated kingfishers is they have a really varied diet. They eat fish, they eat frogs, they eat tiny tadpoles, they eat crabs. They also sometimes will eat lizards. They will eat mice. So they have a really varied diet. And white-throated kingfishers especially, I read an article about how after catching their prey, like if they catch a lizard or sometimes if they catch like a fish, they will actually beat the fish actually against the rock or anything nearby so that it can get a little squashed up so that they can eat it. And what is another fascinating thing about kingfishers is how they make their nests. So unlike other birds that make nests on trees and in other areas above elevation, kingfishers actually make their nests a little bit below the ground. And what I mean by that is that they will actually, in termite mounds or in steep soil banks, they will actually construct tunnels that are about 50 to 100 centimeters long. And within these tunnels, at the end of the tunnel, is where the female kingfisher will actually lay her eggs. And since the chicks are a little bit in that hole underground, they are mostly safe. But a snake can still enter these holes, so the kingfishers actively guard the entrance of these holes. And I've actually watched a couple of videos and documentaries about how if a snake has actually found a kingfisher's nest hole, and if it's trying to enter, the kingfisher will actively hit its beak against the snake. And kingfishers are actually known to be really protective about their nests. And this is a really fascinating thing about kingfishers. And again, they're really common birds in Mumbai. I've seen a couple of kingfishers from my window, and they're really beautiful birds, and they're one of the most fascinating birds ever. Now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about are golden orioles. I've seen so many golden orioles during trails, but from my window I've only seen golden orioles twice. They're one of the most beautiful birds ever. And what's truly fascinating about golden orioles is that I actually read in an article that they will actually reside a lot of times near drongos and near drongo nests. And they do this because, since I mentioned earlier, drongos are highly territorial, and they will actually drive away and mob away any birds like crows or other birds that actually try to even come on the trees that they are on. And what happens is the golden orioles are not a threat to the drongos, and they will actually reside in trees near them so that the drongos can actually aggressively mob away any crows or anything that come near the golden orioles tree as well. And this is a really fascinating thing about golden orioles, and I literally find golden orioles to be one of the most beautiful birds ever. And they're frugivorous birds, and they mostly are seen in the high canopies of really tall trees. And I've seen them only twice, as I mentioned, and they have a really beautiful sound. They're one of the most beautiful sounding birds ever. Now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about, which is really fascinating to me, and that are really common in Mumbai that you can see from your window as well, are the tailor birds. And tailor birds are one of the most unique birds ever, and one of the main things that I find unique about them is how they build their nests. So unlike other birds, tailor birds actually find a leaf and they sew it. They literally sew it. And what I mean by that is they will poke a hole in the leaf with their beak, and they will actually sew it with plant fibers or hay or any tiny thing that they can find. And they actually sew this living leaf to the rest of the tree. So it's literally living, so it's perfectly camouflaged, and the predator doesn't see a nest, but the predator literally sees a living leaf, so it cannot tell that that is a nest of a tailor bird. And that is why tailor birds have one of the best camouflage nests on the planet, and they're really, really unique. They mainly eat caterpillars and other insects and that are crawling on the trees, and they hop around on the branches eating these tiny insects. And another really fascinating thing that I read in another article was that tailor birds, the methods of sowing their nests are quite different from one another in different areas, which means that this is not as purely instinctual, and this is more passed down from generation to generation, and it's a learned behavior. And I find that to be truly, truly fascinating. And tailor birds are one of the most beautiful birds that I've seen, and again, as I mentioned, they're really common from your window. If you guys observe the foliage of the canopy, sometimes if you're really patient and if you look through the canopies of the trees, you might see a tiny, tiny bird hopping through the canopy, and that's a really beautiful tailor bird. They're one of the most beautiful birds ever. And now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about that are again really common that you can see from your window are egrets. And egrets are truly, truly, really fascinating birds, because a lot of times I've seen them flying across the sky during the early morning hours and during the early evening hours. I have not really seen them perched on the trees near my house. During trails, I've seen so many of them perched on trees, as well as feeding in rivers and feeding in streams on tiny fish and tadpoles and frogs. I've seen so many egrets, but from my window, I've only seen them flying across the sky during the early evening hours as well as the early morning hours. And they're one of the most fascinating birds. I've spoken about egrets so much on my podcast before, and I find them to be really fascinating. I've also seen egrets while exploring tide pools in Alibag, where they were actually on the coast eating tiny crustaceans like hermit crabs. They were actually feeding on them. And another fascinating fact about another species of egret called little egret is that how they actually find their food is a lot of times they will actually find shallow areas of ponds and streams where they will actually wade through the mud with their tiny feet, and the crustaceans actually start moving because the soil and silt below gets disturbed, and then they start feeding on these crustaceans. And I find that to be truly, truly fascinating. And egrets are again really common, and if you're patient and if you look at the sky above, sometimes you can see them flying across the sky. They're really common. And now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about that are again really fascinating birds, that if you're lucky and if you're patient and if you sit by a window during the early morning hours and during the early evening hours as well, you can see them soaring up above in the sky. And those are black kites, and black kites are one of the most beautiful birds ever. They're one of the most beautiful birds of prey, and sometimes I've actually seen hundreds of them in the sky above. They're really, really fascinating birds, and they're predators as well as scavengers. They are actually ambush predators as well, where they will like be perched on a tree and they will be observing the ground for any geckos or any squirrels on the trees nearby, and they will actually swoop in and catch the prey. They will also fly above streams, and if they see any fish and if they see any bird like a small egret, they might actually hunt that egret as well. But I've seen so many black kites from my window, and they're really common birds as well, and they're much bigger birds of prey than the shikra and other smaller birds of prey. And they're really, really beautiful birds, and they're quite common. I've seen so many of them from my window in Mumbai. And now the next bird that I'm going to be talking about, and I'm sure you guys must have heard these birds in the morning. They are really, really loud and beautiful birds, and they can be seen a lot of times flying across the sky in the early morning hours. The rose-ringed parakeets. Rose-ringed parakeets are one of the most beautiful birds ever. Rose-ringed parakeets are mainly frugivorous birds. They mainly eat fruits, but they also will sometimes eat vegetables in the wild. And they're truly one of the most fascinating birds, and a lot of times they communally roost during the early evening hours, and a lot of them in that area will actually be sitting together on a tree or be perched on a wire, and then they will actually fly across to the nesting sites together. And they're really loud, and they're one of the most beautiful birds ever. And from my window, I've actually seen two different parakeet species. I've seen the rose-ringed parakeet as well as the Alexandrine parakeets. The Alexandrine parakeets are definitely much larger than the rose-ringed parakeets, and the Alexandrine parakeets also have a much larger beak than the rose-ringed parakeets, and they are also much bigger in size. I have seen Alexandrine parakeets only a couple of times, and they also have a little bit of a red maroon patch over here, and they're truly one of the most beautiful birds. They again eat wild berries and wild fruits, and they also communally roost together. And a lot of times during the early evening hours, you can hear a lot of the calls of rose-ringed parakeets as well as Alexandrine parakeets, and they're one of the most beautiful birds that I've ever seen. And now the next bird that I'm going to be talking to you guys about, that is again a really common bird that I've seen several times from my window, the white-spotted fantail. And these birds are one of the most beautiful birds ever, and they have a really beautiful tail which is like a fan, hence the name white-spotted fantail. And one of the really fascinating features about this bird is that it mainly eats insects. It's an insectivorous bird and it mainly eats caterpillars, beetles, and other tiny insects. And what it actually does is, since its tail is actually in a sort of fan shape, it will actually hop on the branches of the trees. And as it's hopping on the branches of the trees, what happens is that the insects actually get disturbed in the branches of the trees and they actually start moving around, and then the white spotted fantail actually feeds on them. And white spotted fantails are definitely one of the most beautiful birds ever, and they actually again build their nests of really fine grass. So after they've collected the fine grass, they actually make a highly compact cup nest of this fine grass, which they actually keep together by using spider webs as glue that they've collected. And what's even more fascinating is, after they've made this cup nest, they actually keep a hanging thread of debris at the bottom. And that is literally one of the most fascinating nests that I've ever heard of. And I also read in an article about how there was an ecological study done that showed that basically, if the white spotted fantail has made a cup nest, and if a cat or if another predator has actually eaten one of its eggs, or eaten one of the chicks in the nest, they will actually re-engineer that nest completely and make it next time at a really higher elevation compared to that, so that the predator can't get into the nest again. And I find that again to be truly fascinating. And white spotted fantail birds are one of the most common birds that I've seen in Mumbai. And the next bird that I'm going to be talking about is again a bird that I've seen a couple of times. I haven't seen it that many times, but they're quite common during trails, but I have seen them only flying across a couple of times, which is the Indian pond heron. And these are one of the most beautiful birds ever. And again, they mainly eat fish, frogs, tadpoles, and tiny crustaceans like tiny crabs by the ponds. They're diurnal birds, unlike the black-crowned night heron, and they're really beautiful birds. And a couple of times during the early evening hours, when I've seen the egrets fly across the sky, I've actually seen a couple of Indian pond herons fly as well. And I genuinely find Indian pond herons to be one of the most fascinating birds ever. And yeah, the next bird that I'm going to be talking about is a really common bird, and is a bird that I'm sure you guys must have seen from your window: the house sparrows. Sparrows are one of the most common birds I've seen sparrows so many times from my windows, and they're literally one of the most cute and beautiful birds ever. And they're really loud. I often can hear their calls during the early evening hours, and I'll see like a group of them, and literally different groups of them flying across the sky and perched on the trees nearby. Sparrows actually love having dust baths as well. I've seen a couple of sparrows having dust baths as well, and they're one of the most beautiful birds ever. And the next bird that I'm going to be talking about that are really common in Mumbai are the oriental magpie robins. And these birds are really commonly seen from windows, and they're really fascinating birds. They're small birds that can be seen in the canopies of the trees or perched on a branch. And what I find really fascinating about these birds is that they're incredibly territorial, and especially during the breeding season, if there's a male oriental magpie robin on a tree, and if that is its territory, if an other male oriental magpie robin enters the territory, it will actually make a really harsh call to evade off this bird. And a lot of times, to make the environment sound like it is a really overcrowded tree with a lot of different bird species, they can actually mimic sounds of other birds as well to evade off any other bird that's trying to enter their territory. And I find this to be super fascinating. And they're mainly insectivores. They mainly eat beetles, caterpillars, and other insects. But I also read that they also eat smaller vertebrates like lizards and other tiny mammals like mice as well. And although they're really tiny birds, and they're considered insectivores because they mainly eat beetles, caterpillars, and other small insects, they have such a sharp beak that they actually use that beak to eat prey much bigger than it, like fish and sometimes even tiny reptiles like lizards. And they actually poke their beak into the prey, and that's how they kill it and eat it. And they're one of the most fascinating birds ever. And I've seen oriental magpie robins plenty of times from my window, perched on trees, and they're one of the most common birds in Mumbai, and they're one of the most beautiful birds as well. Now, the next species that I'm going to be talking about that I've seen from my window are the purple-rumped sunbirds. And they're quite similar to purple sunbirds. Most of their diet is nectar from flowers like hibiscus and bottlebrush, but they also, during their breeding season, will feed on spiders while collecting the spider webs for their nests. And I find them to be truly fascinating birds. And I guess I've spoken to you guys about most of the common birds that you can see from your window in Mumbai. And yeah, I really hope you guys like this podcast. I had so much fun making this podcast. I love talking about wildlife and nature and birds. And I really hope you guys like this podcast. And if you guys liked it, then hit the like button below, comment down below, and subscribe to my channel if you guys want to watch my podcast every Wednesday. And I'll see you guys in the next podcast. Bye guys. Stay safe and keep loving nature.